the United States and all over the world. This week, Parshas Kisavo, we have the Tochacha, we have the Brachos, and the Gemara tells us that with the way Tosfos understands the Gemara, Nisim Gaon understands it differently, but the way Tosfos understands the Gemara, there was a certain hakpada, there was a certain concern that Parshas Kisavo should never be in the week of Rosh Hashanah. It should be in the week before Rosh Hashanah, but not the week directly in front of Rosh Hashanah, but at the 2 weeks beforehand, 2 Shabbos beforehand, or because there's a simon there, Tichla Shana v'chiloseha. The curses that I mentioned in Kisavo should go out with the new year. So we don't want the Tochacha to be identified with the new year. So we create a small distance between Rosh Hashanah and Parshas Kisavo, which contains the Tochacha. Now, the Gemara tells us that in the Tochacha, which contains the curses that will happen to the Jewish people when they abandon the way of Torah, the Gemara says that we do not make stops in the middle of the Tochacha. The whole Tochacha is read as one aliyah. And the Gemara asks, why is it that way? And the Gemara gives 2 reasons. One is that if you make a stop, you sort of say, it gives an impression that I don't want to hear this anymore. Musar Hashem al timas, the musar, the chastising that you receive from God, the warning that you receive from God, is something that you should not push away. Don't give it an attitude like I am disgusted with it. You have to listen. You have to pay attention. And and then the Gemara gives another reason. And the other reason is because if we divide the Tochacha into different aliyos, so the person getting the second aliyah and the person getting the first aliyah, if he gets it immediately before the Tochacha, so the bracha that he says, that when you go up to the Torah and you get an aliyah, the bracha you say is associated what you're going to immediately read afterwards. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, God says, when my children are being cursed, I don't want a bracha. So because of that, the way the Rishonim explain it, the Liyah starts a couple psukim before the Tochacha, and a couple psukim after the Tochacha is the last bracha, in order not to associate directly the bracha that the person who gets the aliyah makes when he gets up to the Torah. Now we have to understand the reasons for both. Now the reason of Musar Hashem al timas, that you shouldn't show disgust with the chastising, with the musar of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is because the idea is the Tochacha, usually when we read the Torah is read as Limud HaTorah. It's the study of the Torah. But here there is an experiential nature also to the Tochacha. In other words, I'm not just reading about the curses that HaKadosh Baruch Hu or that Moshe Rabbeinu told the Jewish people that what would happen if they abandoned the way of God. But it's not a question of just studying. It's a question of experiencing it being told by Hakadosh Baruch Hu. We know there is a minhag in Ashkenazi communities that by the Aseret Dibros everybody stands. Why? Because by the Aseret Dibros it's not just studying what the Aseret Dibros, what the Ten Commandments told us, but it's experiencing the getting of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people, because of the revelation, they all stood at Mount Sinai. So because of that, the custom in Ashkenazi communities is to stand during the Aseret Bros. So even though most of the Torah, when we read it on Shabbos, is seen primarily from the perspective of studying and learning, but the Aseret Dibros, the Az Yosher, that's to be viewed not just from the perspective of studying and learning. From the perspective of studying and learning, we could make stops in the middle. It doesn't take away. On the contrary, sometimes when we make a stop, and it gives us chance to focus, to understand. We're able to study better. But from an experiential perspective, when I am being chastised, that when I am being warned, it's not just to study what I was warned, but in a sense to experience that warning. And because of that, they couldn't make stops, because making stops turns it only into the perspective of study rather than experience the situation. So that's the reason. Musar Hashem al timas. Don't show that you're disgusted with it. In other words, you have to experience the curses given either by God or by Moshe Rabbeinu. But then the other reason is we don't want to associate the curses with the bracha that the person makes when he gets the aliyah. Now, we don't want to associate the bracha. Why? Reb Chaim Volozhiner, when he talks about about bracha, what is bracha? He says, this is sort of his introduction to Kabbalah, to the study of Jewish mysticism, if you want. He says that to a certain degree, God allowed man to give him power. Of course, God is all powerful. But God placed limitations on himself and gave man the ability, and specifically the Jew, Reb Chaim Volozhiner says, in a sense, to place limitations on God or to add strength to God. When we do Torah and mitzvahs, we are giving strength to God. But when we act in an improper manner, when we leave the Torah and we do not act in the manner that God felt that we should act, so figuratively we are weakening God. Not chas v'shalom, God couldn't be weakened, but God allows man figuratively, allows the Jew figuratively to tie his hands. He places limitations Man has the ability to place limitations on God. Not that God couldn't get rid of those limitations, but God, in creating man, in creating the Jewish people, so he endowed man and later on the Jewish people with this ability to give God strength and to get, in a sense, figuratively, to weaken God. And this is bracha, according to Reb Chaim Volozhin, means tosvus koach, additional strength. And the Nesivus, in his Perish Hanecha, he says something very interesting. He says, in regard to the pasuk, Pi Elyon, from the mouth of up high, meaning from the mouth of God, Lo seitze haros v'hatov, from the mouth of God, the bad in the plural does not come, and the tov in the singular does not come. And he's intrigued. Why is it that we say that the bad in the plural doesn't come from God, and the tov, the good in the singular, doesn't come from God? And the Nesivus, in his Perish Hanecha, he says that there are two goods, two forms of good and two forms of bad. One form of good is the good that man does, the mitzvos that he does, when he acts properly, when he does what's expected of him, when he shows commitment and concern, proper commitment and proper concern. That's the good that he does. But as a result of the good that he does, there is the good that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that comes as a result. That comes as a result of the good that he did. In a sense, you could call it reward. When we act properly, there is favor shown to us. And then there is the bad. There's the bad that we do. When we deviate from the Torah, when we act improperly, when we don't do what is correct. And then there is the bad that happens to us as a result of the bad that we did. And all the way down, Adam Arishon, when he ate from the Eitz Hadas, the bad that happened to him was the leaving of of Gan Eden, whatever it is, and throughout history, when we deviated from the path, there was bad that happened. But the Nesivus, in his Perish Palgei Mayim Anecha, he says, when it comes to the bad, it's not that God does the bad. Many people have made a lot of money in trying to explain why bad things happen to good people. They made a lot of money in writing books as to why the Holocaust happened. Sometimes when they write in their books Sometimes it's apicursus. It's heresy. Sometimes it's a display of lack of knowledge. And the ultimate answer, of course, is we don't know. We don't understand about the greatest tragedies. But the Palgemayim, the Nesivis, he sheds light in a general manner. He said it's not that God brings the bad, but when we sin and we act improperly, to a certain degree, God withdraws. We tied his hands. And God is not God, because of this, what he imposed upon himself in giving man power, God doesn't interfere. In a sense, our destiny at that point, our limited destiny, not the long-term destiny, chas v'shalom, is left up to nature. And so this is, I think, what the bracha represents the strength of God. It represents the Jew giving power to God. But klala, when the Jew is cursed, when the curses are taking place, in a sense that represents the withdrawal of God. The Gemara is saying, I think, that God doesn't want that the klalos, the catastrophes that overtake the Jewish people, to be identified with his strength. On the contrary, with the weakness. It's not a real weakness, but it's a withdrawal because of the power that God gave to us. He gave to the Jewish people. And so because of this, the bracha over the portion of the Torah in this week's Sedra that talks about the klalos of the tragedies that are going to overtake the Jewish people because they acted improperly, shouldn't be identified immediately with the bracha, which is the strength of God. Now, and then the Gemara tells us this halacha that we don't make stops in the klolos when we read the curses. There are two places in the Torah where we have parshios dedicated that are called Tochacha, that talk about the tragedies that are going to overcome the Jewish people because they sinned. One is at the end of Chumash Vayikra B'chukosai, and the other place is in this week's Sedra in Kisavo. And the Gemara says that the halacha that we don't make stops in the middle of the Tochacha for the two reasons that I previously mentioned only applies to the Tochacha at the end of Chumash Vayikra and B'chukosai. It does not apply, the Gemara says, to Parshas Kisavo, which is the reading of the Shabbos. And the Gemara asks the question, why is it that way? Why is it that the halacha that you can't make a stop in the middle of the Tochacha, in the middle of the curses, only applies to Parshas B'chukosai, the end of Vayikra. It doesn't apply to this week's Sedra, to the curses mentioned in Parshas Kisavo. And the Gemara gives two reasons. One reason the Gemara gives is that in Bahar, excuse me, in the Tochacha of at the end of Vayikra, B'chukosai. So there, it's said in the plural form. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will do so. I will. God, it's speaking God's name. God says, I will do such and such. Or such and such will happen to you. So it's in a plural form. In other words, these things are going to happen on a national level. It won't be just one small community. And certainly in time of the first Commonwealth, when all the Jewish people were together or in close proximity, and certainly it was easy to understand this idea of tragedy overtaking the Jewish people, all the Jewish people. He says, however, in this week's Sedra, Parshas Kisavo, the curses are given in the singular. In other words, the tragedies that will take place one community at a time, a few Jews at a time, primarily, and to a large degree. That's what we are experiencing today. It starts with one community. And the Tochacha in Bechukosai at the end of Vayikra, that's in the plural form, is considered more severe. So we have to be stricter over there. And because of this, we can't make stops. But here, in this week's Sedra, it talks in the singular form. It's not talking about catastrophes overtaking the Jewish people at one time, at one period of time. But overtaking all the Jewish people. So we have to, so over here it's not so severe. So you're allowed to make stops according to the Gemara. And then the Gemara gives another reason. The Gemara says, there it says, God says in Bechukosai, it's Moshe saying over in God's name. So in a sense, it's God that is cursing the Jewish people, that is imposing the curses on the Jewish people, and but in the Kisavo Chumash Dvarim, there it's Moshe himself that's saying it in his own name. Moshe Rabbeinu in Kisavo. So so Ubo Alecha Klalos Eila Visigucha arata. It's not saying he's not saying it over in God's name, but he's saying it in his own name, that God will do this. So because of that, Parshas Kisavo is considered not as severe as Parshas Bechukosai, where it's God who is putting the curses. And in Kisavo, it's Moshe Rabbeinu who is placing the curses, which is not as severe. However, the Rambam points out, and that's the custom in all shuls, that today we do not make stops in either one of the two. And the question is, why did the custom change? Why is it that in the time of the Gemara, the only in Bechukosai, you did not have to in the time of the Gemara in Bechukosai, you could not make stops, but in Kisavo you could make stops. And today the custom is, even in Kisavo, we don't make stops. What is it? What change took place? How are we to understand it? Now, I think we could explain it the following manner. In one reason that the Gemara gave to distinguish is because there it's Lashon Rabim, it's in the plural form. In Bechukosai, it's in the plural form, and in Kisavo, it's in the singular form. The idea is, in other words, these will be catastrophes that will overtake the whole Jewish people. In Bechukosai, in Kisavo, it's in the singular form. It will overtake individuals, communities. It doesn't say that it will overtake all the Jewish people. Now, I think the idea behind this is that I mentioned Chaf Sivan, Rabbeinu Tam, because there was one town in Europe that had a blood libel, and many people in that town were burnt at the stake, were killed. There was never any evidence. There was never any evidence that a Jewish child was killed. There was never any evidence that any Jews were involved. If anything, the limited evidence that they had implied that there were non-Jews that might have killed a non-Jewish child. But nevertheless, the Jews were chosen as scapegoats. And as a result of that was, even though in England they had a blood libel before, but this is considered like the first blood libel against the Jews, because here the government was involved. In England, the government was not involved in the blood libel, but here the government was involved. This is where governments actively were involved in making up lies to kill Jews. So Rabbeinu Tam declared a fast. It's a fast day that was never really accepted by the Jewish people. There were all kinds of questions why it wasn't accepted. And the question is, this was something that happened in one small town, one city. Why did Rabbeinu Tam proclaim a fast day? For all generations, For all of Ashkenazic Jewry, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam, they were the two heads of Ashkenazic Jewry. They didn't have authority over Sephardic Jewry. They couldn't proclaim something for Sephardic Jewry. So why did he proclaim? This was shortly before Rabbeinu Tam died. Why did Rabbeinu Tam? It was an incident that happened in one town. We would understand if he proclaimed the fast day for that town, for the tragedy that happened in that town. You know, it's less and less so, but many of the yeshivas at post-World War II, on the day that rebuilt in America, rebuilt in Israel, on the day that the yeshiva in Europe was destroyed, that the people in the town were murdered, they treated it as a day of mourning, as a day of tshuva, perhaps even fasting for the individual town. They did it. But what Rabbeinu Tam proclaimed, and Rabbeinu Tam thought that this fast day will become more important than Tzom Gedalia. Why is it that way? And in a sense, why didn't the Jewish people, why wasn't Rabbeinu Tam's Takana accepted? And I think the reason is that because Rabbeinu Tam understood something that the Jews of his time didn't understand. And unfortunately, the Jews of today do not understand it. We see it today. And even during World War II, I talked with survivors, and they had information, not exact information, about what was taking place in Europe. Some who might have had the ability to get away early enough, but they didn't, and they were aware of what happened in other countries. Some were skeptical about it, but they didn't run. Why? It happened over there. We don't have to worry about it. Rabbeinu Tam understood that once this tragedy happened in this one town in France, that with the government's involvement, it's going to spread from town to town and from country to country. And we had pogroms throughout Jewish history. One town, next town. But each town, except for Tach V'Tat, except during the Chomensky's time, except, of course, during the Holocaust. But for the most part, there was always pogroms. But each pogrom was a separate pogrom. I think that's what the Gemara is telling us. The Gemara is telling us that in the earlier years, there were disasters, and the Parshas B'chukosai talks about local disasters. It happened in one town, it'll happen in another city, in another area. So, because of that, it's not to be compared to the tragedies that are discussed in Parshas B'chukosai. In Parshas B'chukosai, we talk about tragedies that overtake all of the Jewish people. But with the passage of time, ultimately, the local tragedies over the span of hundreds of years. These tragedies, one time or another, hit most of the communities of the Jewish people. So what was a localized tragedy became a national tragedy. The unfortunate thing is that we continue to see it as localized tragedies. And maybe there was a need for the Jewish people to come to recognize that at a certain point when we see local tragedies, that it becomes very quickly a national tragedy. And if we are not moved by the local tragedies, if we don't take action, both spiritually and otherwise, the local tragedies will spread like wildfire. History, the wheels of history, used to move very slowly. But the wheels of history today move very quickly. There's a war in Israel. The next day, there is anti-Semitism. Jews are being attacked. Synagogues are being attacked. Each day, another place. Oh, it's just one place. We have to look at history. And that's the tragedy that we are facing today. And part of it is when tragedy takes place, when tragedy takes place, it sends, as I mentioned before, in the name of Chaim Volozhiner, in the name of the name of the Palgei Bayim, the Nesivos Hamishpat, and his Perish Hanecha. Part of it is that it's not so much that God brings this tragedy, even though the Torah says that God says he will bring these things. That means he withdraws, and these things happen. So because of that, because of that, the withdrawal of God, when God withdraws, it becomes part of nature. And that's the direction of nature. Nature is when something, human nature, when they attack the Jews in one town, that opens up the gates for the Jews of another town to be attacked. Torah tells us why was Amalek, this last week's Sedra, why was Amalek in a sense singled out more so than all the other enemies of the Jewish people? And the answer, Chazal tell us, is that Amalek opened the door. He set the precedent. Even though Amalek was destroyed, but his attacking of the Jewish people set the precedent for the other towns, for the other places, for the other countries, for the other nations. And that's part of nature. Part of nature is when you see something happening in one town, in one city, in one area, it's happening over and over and over again. And now it's happening very quickly. Just look at the United States. Look at the changes that took place. It starts in one place, and then it continues into another place and in a third place. And it's not just on a national level, it's on local levels also. So at a certain point, it became clear after this time and time again, the tragedies affected individual towns, individual communities, but it became part of nature. Once it becomes part of nature, when God withdraws, it's more likely to happen. Because of that, they felt that we have to treat Parshas Kisavo as Kisavo in the same manner that we treat the Parshas Bechukosai. Our local tragedies become national tragedies. At one time, it didn't happen so quickly, but now it happens very, very quickly. That's what the Holocaust should have taught us. That's what October 7th and the aftermath of October 7th should have taught us. But unfortunately, it's just over there. It's just in Israel. It's the fault of Netanyahu, who actually probably was the best leader that the Jewish people had under these circumstances. But we're all looking for excuses why it isn't affecting me. And then it's interesting that the other reason given is because the curses mentioned in Parshas Bechukosai, it's God's curses, and the tragedy, the way the Gra understood the difference between Chumash Dvarim and the other Chumashim. In the first four Chumashim, God speaks through the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu. So really, it's God talking. So the tragedies in Parshas Bechukosai, it's God talking through the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu. But in Parshas Kisavo, that's in Chumash Dvarim. Chumash Dvarim, in a sense, Moshe assumes the role of a Navi. Till now, Moshe was in a category all by himself. Of course, Moshe remained Avi HaNeviim, the father of all Neviim. There's no question about it. But according to the Gra, in Aderes Eliyahu, in Parshas Dvarim, he speaks in the style of the Nevi'im. Not God speaking through his mouth as he does in the first four Chumashim. Rashi says he speaks Baruch HaKodesh through divine inspiration. So the curses are Moshe Rabbeinu's curses. Whereas in Bechukosai, it's God's curses. Now, the question is, what is how we to understand it? I think it's very interesting. The Gemara tells us that if a Navi comes and a Navi tells us of a good thing that's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, so he's a Navi Hasheker. He's a false Navi. But he says if a Navi comes and the Navi tells us of a bad thing, if a prophet comes and tells us of an impending catastrophe, and it doesn't happen, it does not prove that he's a false Navi. A positive thing that he says If it doesn't happen, he's a false navi, a negative thing. For whatever reason, God chose not to do it. And I think in the first four Chumashim, of course, this doesn't apply to Moshe Rabbeinu. But in the Chumash Dvarim, Moshe Rabbeinu, in a sense, becomes like one of the Nevi'im, like one of the prophets. It's still included in the Chumshei Torah. But he speaks in the manner of a Navi, according to the Gra, not Daris Aliyahu. So, initially, they did not consider this curses in Parshas Kisavo as being so tragic, such a catastrophe, because they saw it only as a warning that it might not happen, because it was Moshe Rabbeinu talking as a Navi, not talking in his unique position as Moshe Rabbeinu. But unfortunately, throughout the tragedies of Golus that the Jewish people suffered, in one form or another, if not all the tragedies mentioned in Kisavo, almost all the tragedies mentioned in Kisavo have taken place. And in a sense, they have become part of nature. And since they became part of nature, nature tends to repeat itself. And the more often happens, the greater the trend in nature, as I mentioned before. So because of that, we have to treat Parshas Kisavo, the tragedies of Parshas Kisavo, because today, the tragedies that happen in one community, the tragedies that are mentioned only in Kisavo from the curses of Moshe Rabbeinu, because of the way we acted, all unfortunately, or almost all, have happened. But these are not one-time tragedies. And when it becomes part of nature because of the withdrawal of God, nature tends to repeat itself. And especially the nature of the action of anti-Semites. And worse than that is the indifference of some of the Jewish people who fail to recognize what the anti-Semites are doing, that are stupid enough to march with them against their brothers and sisters, who feel that their brothers and sisters have no right to defend themselves. And all because they didn't yet come to their houses. But unfortunately, what happens in one area happens in another area also, especially when it comes part of nature. And it's interesting, at the end of the Tochacha, at the end of the curses in this week's Sedra, the Torah says, you shall sell yourselves as slaves, la'avadim, v'lashfachos, and as maid servants, ve'ein kona, and no one is going to buy you. It's interesting, the Zohar asks a question. He says, at the end of the Tochacha, in Parshas in the end of the Tochacha in Parshas B'chukosai. So there there is words of consolation. V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, v'afes brisi Yitzchak, v'afes brisi Avram esko. I'll remember the covenant of the Avos. He says at the end of this Tochacha, how does this Tochacha end? That things are going to be so bad, you will be taken in boats to Egypt, and you will sell yourselves to your enemies, to be slaves and to be maidservants. They ain't kona, but no one's going to buy you. And the Zohar says a very interesting thought. The Zohar says, you're going to want to rid yourself of your Jewish identity. And you'll stop putting on tefillin, you'll stop putting on talis, you'll stop doing mitzvahs. But they'll always see you as a Jew. So then you'll want to become part of their nation. But the only way in your mind that you can become part of their nation, and in a sense for them to see you, and the Jewish people in Egypt, they're constantly saying, let's go back to Egypt when they rebel against Moshe. They were for such a long period of time slaves in Egypt. But they identified themselves as citizens of Egypt. Slaves, but citizens. They identified themselves as being part of the Egyptian people. And whenever there was a problem, they wanted to rid themselves of their Jewish identity. And they were willing to become slaves in their mind, thinking they will be able to rid themselves of their Jewish identity. But ve'ein koneh, and that has been the destiny of the Jewish people time and time again. The Jews thought, oh, I'll be an American. And by being, and what happened little by little, the more American, they thought that the more American they'll become, the less Jewish they'll be. They won't be identified as being a Jew. They have a bad self-perspective as a Jew. And but you're not going to be accepted. Look how Jewish senators, the head of in my mind, the head of the capos today, Schumer, calls himself, he has the chutzpah to call himself the Shomer Yisrael. Police are called Shomrim. They watch over us. And the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, they appointed Jewish police to watch over the Jews. Those were the capos. If Schumer is Shomer Yisrael, he's a capo. He talks of the big tent with all the anti-Semites. And he fails to recognize the Ein Koneh. They'll make their own tent, and he'll be kicked out of it. Ein Koneh. It's time we stop being slaves. We have to be servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And hopefully, more than that, we will become, together with being servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we will be the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is what we have to, these days, when disaster when Jews are being attacked from one city. Okay, in most cities right now, it's not on a major scale. It's not October 7th yet. And those people that want to be blind pat themselves on the back. And there are those that even support those that are killing their brothers and sisters. And then they justify themselves with, as I mention all the time, by saying they see themselves as universalists, dedicated to mankind. I didn't see them protesting after October 7th as they're protesting against this government of Israel, against the Jewish people in Israel. They talk about genocide. When Israel would give a warning before they threw bombs in civilian areas. Did the Palestinians ever give a warning? But you want to sell yourselves as slaves. You become a slave. And you talk about the big tent. We have to be dedicated to all the people of the world. We have to be universalists. But our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism, not our Judaism from our universalism. Unfortunately, when Judaism emanates from universalism, it's an act of suicide. We have to dedicate ourselves to all human beings. Rosh Hashanah soon coming up. Rosh Hashanah is a universal holiday. It's very interesting. Rosh Chodesh. We don't mention Rosh Chodesh prominently in the Rosh Hashanah davening, even though Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh also. It's the first of the month of Tishrei. And it's only mentioned, according to some opinions, in a very limited way. We don't emphasize the Rosh Chodesh emphasis. We don't have Kiddush HaChodesh, proclaiming of the new month, the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, because we don't want to emphasize the Rosh Chodesh element. Why is it that way? Why is it that on Rosh Hashanah we only emphasize Rosh Hashanah, but we don't emphasize Rosh Chodesh? And the answer is, I think, Rosh Chodesh, as contrasted from all the other Jewish holidays, was a very private holiday, certainly on a biblical level. What did the holiday of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, the new month, manifest itself? In giving a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash. It was quiet, it was hidden. It was in privacy. It represented the private relationship between God and the Jewish people. Rosh Hashanah, on the other hand, is a universal holiday. And Kol Ba'olam, all of mankind stands before God. But as Rashi says at the beginning, Bereshis, that the world was created ultimately for the Jewish people. Not that we're going to subjugate the other people, chas v'shalom. That's never been our desire. But we have to be B'nai B'chorei Yisrael. We have to lead the world to come to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this was the reason. This was the reason Amalek attacked the Jewish people. Not so much because of the anti-Semitism, but because the Jewish people, they saw the Jewish people being the people of God. And unfortunately, Amalek is still alive there. And whatever religion they have, undoubtedly somewhere they recognize the B'nai B'chori Yisrael. And their war against the Jewish people is a war against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a war against God. And Amalek's philosophy has spread all over the world. We have to remember, yes, Universalism is very important. Rosh Hashanah is a universalistic day, a day dedicated to universalism. And we have an obligation to the whole world. But our obligation to the whole world emanates from our Jewishness. And Rosh Hashanah, when we dedicate ourselves, we have to remember when we blow the shofar, we're recognizing, we're re-experiencing Maimer Har Sinai. We're re-experiencing the unique and special relationship that God had with the Jewish people. So we cannot let our universalism mold our Judaism, but it has to be our Judaism molding our universalism. This is the lesson, because if we allow our universalism to mold our Judaism, we're going to get to this situation that we're going to be selling ourselves emotionally, politically, and ultimately maybe even physically as slaves and maidservants. We'll try to sell ourselves because somehow we think that will give us greater prominence. But Ve'ein Kona, none of them are going to be interested in us. As Rashi says, they'll just kill us. We have to have, yes, our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism, not the reverse.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. One question is if the Balkori reads the Tochacha too softly, is that a problem?
It depends if you can hear it or not. If you can't hear it, it's a problem.
I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but Rabbi Irving Greenberg spoke of the Holocaust constituting a breaking of the covenant and is somehow connected with God's withdrawal from the world. How do you see that view?
I didn't read his article. I don't want to comment on it. But according to him, I think for what I picked up on the street, I didn't read his article, so maybe I shouldn't even say. But from what I heard, I think he said that somehow that withdrawal means that there is no relationship between God and the Jewish people anymore, something like that. I don't know, whatever it is. But anyway,
If anyone would hold that view, would you agree with that view?
obviously not.
Okay.
There's certainly no total withdrawal of God. That's for sure. It's God is waiting for us. That's what the Shiva de Nechemta is. The 7 weeks of consolation is God saying, "I want to have a relationship with you. Anochi, Anochi hu menachemchem. I want a personal relationship with you." And then we answered next week's Haftorah. We answered that you have clothed us in clothes of salvation. You have dressed us like a chassan, and like a kala, jewelry of a kala. In other words, our relationship with you today is a marriage relationship. It's a love relationship.
I mean, just not
That's
just to put
that
this
God.
on.
That God. In other words, we recognize that God wants to have this relationship with us. In
I mean,
other words,
just
after Tisha B'av, we begin to have doubts. We begin to have doubts, but then we go through the Shiva and the Chemta, and we erase those doubts. God lets us know that He wants a personal relationship with us.
I mean, just if someone's putting out an extreme view like that, there are other people who've published things that say that the Holocaust was Gilui Shechina. I
Yeah,
mean,
okay. I know.
people.
That's correct. That's correct. Actually, trying to think. Yeah, he spoke one many years ago. He spoke at a Yavna convention where someone said that nonsense many years ago. Right? This before I moved to Chicago. It was probably 1966, 65, around then. He spoke at a Yavna convention where someone who spoke at there said that nonsense. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, it's not.